Item: SCP-1395. Code name: Cave Apparition. Object Class: Euclid. Special Containment Procedures: Foundation agents shall work with the governments of Greece and the European Union to suppress public knowledge of SCP-1395. A barbed wire fence measuring 3 meters in height and 20 meters in length shall be erected to prevent unauthorized access to SCP-1395, with at least 3 security outposts stationed in the surrounding area. Unauthorized civilians attempting to access SCP-1395 shall be administered Class B amnestics and redirected elsewhere. Description: SCP-1395 is a cave located near Mount, Greece. Carbon dating of human remains and artifacts present within the cave suggest human habitation first began around BCE, which is consistent with SCP-1395's claimed history. See below. Surveys conducted by Foundation personnel suggest a depth of at least 500 meters. Requests no longer accepted. See Addendum 1395-A. SCP-1395's anomalous properties manifest when persons travel approximately 300 meters inside the cave. After reaching this point, SCP-1395-A will manifest, blocking the path leading deeper into the cave, though not with any apparent hostile intent. SCP-1395-A is a humanoid entity, appearing to observers as a silhouetted apparition roughly 1.8 meters in height. Though it will not forcefully impede any attempts to leave the cave, percent of persons encountering SCP-1395-A report a strong desire to stay within its presence. SCP-1395-A identifies itself as, and claims that it lived in the ancient Greek city-state of Charistus around BCE. Through unknown means, it was bound to the cave, see interview log, and apparently cannot manifest anywhere outside of it. SCP-1395-A speaks in the native language of whomever it is addressing. When questioned, however, it will insist it is speaking Attic Greek. If approached by an individual or group, SCP-1395-A will engage the subject in conversation, appearing to derive pleasure from describing and recounting its presumed life. Following the encounter, SCP-1395-A will demanifest, erasing all memories of the encounter from the individual's mind. This will likewise affect written material, rendering writing on any sort of physical surface during the event illegible. However, digital records are not affected, making recording equipment a necessity when interacting with SCP-1395-A. SCP-1395-A Interview Logged 1. Access granted. Dr. Hello. SCP-1395-A. SCP-1395-A. Another has come? For so long, there was nothing, and now, it seems the visits have become more frequent. Dr. How so? SCP-1395-A. Time is a difficult thing to measure in the void. The days and the months and years fold in, collapse upon the weight of the blackness. But I have managed. You and your Foundation, was it? You have an interest in me. Dr. We do, yes. Specifically, we would like to inquire about the details of your current condition, and its origins. SCP-1395-A. Ask. I will answer, though I must confess my memories have faded over time. Dr. You claim to have been a man living in Charistus during the ancient Greek era. Is that true? SCP-1395-A. Ancient? That you would use such a term tells me a very long time has passed indeed. I wonder what has become of my home. Dr. Please answer the question. SCP-1395-A. Yes, I once called Charistus my home. I was a simple merchant, living a comfortable existence. I was not wealthy, but neither was I starving, which is more than I could say for many of my countrymen. Doctor. How did you first encounter this cave? SCP-1395-A. It was a warm day in spring. Or was it summer? I cannot remember. Business was good, despite a few thieves trying to take from my stall. I was about to close up for the day, when an old man came up to my stall. He was a beggar, and asked me for a few morsels to subsist off of. Naturally, I refused. Doctor. Why? SCP-1395-A. It was a time of famine. The crops had dried up inexplicably, and people were desperately sacrificing to the gods to reverse our fortune. I am not heartless, but had I given food out to everyone who asked, I would have been broke in 3 days. Doctor. I see. What happened next? SCP-1395-A. He stared at me, a more deadly and intent gaze I have yet to encounter. He cursed me in the name of the Pantheon, and declared me forsaken in the eyes of the gods. I assumed he was a priest, as he had the curse memorized. Doctor. What did he do after that? SCP-1395-A. He ran. He thought, correctly, that I would give him a thrashing for cursing me in such a way. Doctor. How long was it before you found yourself in this state? SCP-1395-A. 4 months. Nothing occurred in the intervening time, aside from the usual fluctuations in business familiar to any merchant. It was the beginning of the cold season, and I had closed my shop for the evening when I was attacked by a thug. It was over in a few moments. I felt his blade go through me and my life deteriorate. And then, the blackness. He pauses. Doctor. Yes. SCP-1395-A. It has been an eternity, yet I still remember his eyes. Those eyes. I felt as if I could see Hades through them. As if he were possessed by the gods themselves. Doctor. Moving on. How long was it until you were first discovered? SCP-1395-A. Do you remember what I told you earlier? Time moves differently in the void. It is difficult to describe to a presence of flesh. But if I were to estimate, I would say a few decades. Doctor. Describe your first contact with a human. SCP-1395-A. A distortion is heard, presumed to be laughter of some sort. I was not as composed as I am now. The first one I met was an old one, an Athenian, judging by his attire. I screamed, so he ran, naturally. Then I felt myself imparting something upon him, and I vanished once more. Doctor. The Amnesiac Effect you have? SCP-1395-A. If that is what you would refer to it as, yes. It went like that during my first awakenings. A traveler chanced upon my cave. I appeared, they ran, and they forgot. It was not until some time later that I had my first true conversation. Doctor. Do you remember what this person looked like? SCP-1395-A. He was dressed in a form of armor I did not recognize, and had a strange cross symbol upon his chest. I assumed he was a foreigner, yet he spoke Greek. Despite his insistence he was speaking a language he called English. Doctor. How did he react to you? SCP-1395-A. I had composed myself to the point where appearing was no longer a shock. So I greeted him. He asked if I was the ghost of a Christ. When I said no, he asked if I was another fellow named Peter. This went on for a while until I explained my origin, as I am to you now. We talked for a while, then he left. Doctor. This is how your meetings have gone since then? SCP-1395-A. I suppose so, yes. I am not some trickster god, looking to fool those who speak to me. I am merely a restless, lonely soul, looking for a way to stem the eternal emptiness for a time. Doctor. One final question. Your amnesiac effect is not voluntary, correct? SCP-1395-A. Making them forget? Of course not. I would love for people to return. I suspect it was part of the curse. What sort of suffering is worse than being alone forever? Dr. Thank you. SCP-1395-A. That will be all. SCP-1395-A. Gestures to Dr. S tape recorder. These devices of yours, they allow you to remember? Dr. In a manner of speaking, yes. SCP-1395-A. That is good. If you remember, return once more. The coldness, the void, it weighs upon me, and if I am never to leave this place, at least I shall have some company. SCP-1395-A demanifests. Dr. S memory of the encounter erased as expected. Since its discovery by Foundation personnel, SCP-1395-A has been consistently cooperative. Further interviews are recommended in order to better understand its anomalous properties. Addendum 1395-A. During an exploration on Comma, researchers managed to reach a depth of meters without encountering SCP-1395-A. At this point, the exploration team reportedly become unable to move, and all equipment carried by personnel ceased functioning. Doctor claims to have briefly, redacted, shortly before going into catatonic shock and had to be transported out of the cave for medical assistance. When SCP-1395-A was questioned on this occurrence, it replied, "Do not attempt to join me," and immediately demanifested. Both SCP-1395-A and Dr. have consistently refused to discuss the incident since the date, the latter claiming "You wouldn't understand even if I told you." Following this incident, all survey requests proposing exploration past the 500-meter mark are preemptively denied.